Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here for our final panel of the day in the Europasaal on day one of the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue. Ports and urban areas moving towards a post-fossil future. At first glance, maybe it doesn't seem to go together, but I know that our panelists who are here today are going to weave a story for us that lets us know why ports and urban areas belong together. And what we're going to look at during our panel today is which technologies and concepts can be used to decarbonize urban areas and ports to create post-fossil economies. Joining me for today's panel are here in the middle, my apologies. Here in the middle, Kirsty Burger, the Director of Energy and Climate Change in Scotland. Johanna Christensen, the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Maritime Forum. Susana Hufnagel, the Head of Sales and Business Solutions for Vattenfall. And Fatsia Pusterla, the representative for the IDB Group office in Europe at the Office of Outreach and Partnerships at the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining me this afternoon for this panel. We might have some time for audience questions later this afternoon, but I'd like to start off with the first round of questions, each looking at how we can speed up the decarbonization in urban areas and ports. Kirsty Burger, I'd like to start with you. Now, I know that Scotland aims to achieve its net zero carbon goal by 2045, but by 2032, Scotland will already meet well above 100% of its electricity demand with renewables. I know that wind power is leading the way, but you're also increasingly using innovative tidal and wave power systems as well. When it comes to thermal energy production, though, the usage of fossil energies is still high. What are your government's key policies to ensure rapid decarbonization of urban areas and Scottish ports?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the audience who are hanging on until 5 o'clock this evening. So it's the hardcore here, but it's great to see you all here. So I'll actually start quite broad and talk a little bit about what we're doing in Scotland, and then I'll try to weave together what we're doing on urban areas and ports. In Scotland, we have, as you said, quite very ambitious climate change targets. We have also got a very strong track record. We have reduced our emissions by 50% on 1990 levels, which I think is well, not quite unique, but I think it's a pretty impressive track record. And that has been through decarbonising our electricity system, basically moving away from coal to renewables. But we do in Scotland have the opportunity to go much, much further. We are a fairly small country population-wise. We are 5.4 million people. But our renewable resources in Scotland are absolutely vast. And that's particularly in terms of expansion, in terms of offshore wind, where we have a potential pipeline of about 40 gigawatts in the fairly near future. And with that comes the potential to produce hydrogen, and particularly green hydrogen as well. So the potential is enormous there, and it's fantastic to be here at the conference because we've had a number of conversations with German colleagues in particular on the opportunity to produce hydrogen and export to Germany. So, I mean, I'll kind of weave in some of our targets, but we have the potential to produce about half a million tonnes of hydrogen by 2030, looking up to about 3 million tonnes by 2045, which can, obviously help us in Scotland decarbonise our energy system, so both the renewable electricity and potentially the hydrogen. But I think, it's a small, resource-rich country with a strong history of innovation in energy and production of energy through our oil and gas sector. We've got a real opportunity to support colleagues in people in Europe and also Germany in particular. So just moving this down to cities and ports, I'll say a couple of things, and I'm sure we'll pick up a lot of this in conversation. So in Scotland, the transport sector and the building sector together accounts for about 45% of our emissions. So that's a really, really good chunk of it, and a large part of that is in urban areas. In the UK and in Scotland, we have quite an old housing stock, Victorian houses, so that, a lot of them are heated by gas. So the big challenge for us now is demand reduction, so shifting from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And in housing, in decarbonising our buildings, we see the two key technologies being heat networks, and we were talking quite a bit about this before we started on the panel, and also electrification with potentially some role for hydrogen in relation to heat networks. On ports, well, you can say, ports and harbours, you can say a bunch of things around ports and harbours, and I think there are two angles we can come at this at. So one is around creating economic opportunities which are net zero focused in our ports and harbours. In Scotland, we have a lot of ports and harbours that are focused on the oil and gas industry, and our challenge now is to support the people who live in cities like Aberdeen and some of the cities on the west coast, transition and find opportunities in the net zero economy. So I'll maybe come back to that. And then the second opportunity is obviously on decarbonising ports and harbours, actually the operations in themselves. In Scotland, one of the things we're really focused on is that first piece, which is around creating the economic opportunities, be that in offshore wind, be that in hydrogen, because people have the skills and the expertise, and we have a deep and broad level of companies that have are operating in the oil and gas sector, but where actually a lot of that skill and expertise is transferable to renewables industries.
Thank you very much, Kirsty Burger. We're going to come back to decarbonising urban areas in another round of questions, but first, Johanna Christensen. Ports are often connected to the infrastructure of major cities. And now I know the Global Maritime Forum has started the Getting to Zero Coalition, which is partly funded by the World Economic Forum. The 200 signatory organizations from the maritime sector committed to achieving the complete decarbonization of shipping by 2050, which is it's a pretty big goal to have. And what are the important milestones that need to be met along the way in order to reach this goal?
Well, thank you for those questions. Maybe it'd be useful to give a little bit of context about the maritime sector and its decarbonization. So first of all, it's considered one of the hard-to-abate sectors, and one of the reasons for that is that it cannot be directly electrified, except for when ships are in port or traveling very short distances, for example, along coastal areas, ferries and the like. So most of the ships will need to transition to another kind of fuel than the fossil fuels that are used today. Another big part of the challenge is that it's a highly disaggregated and sort of fragmented industry. Save for a few major players in container shipping, it's lots and lots of small ship owners, highly disaggregated value chains with lots of different linkages between that makes it really hard to move the sector as a whole. Another big challenge is the scale of the problem. So shipping today uses about 300 million tons of fossil fuels on an annual basis. And that's to power about 80,000 ships that trade globally. And that's everything from plowing across the Pacific Ocean to small coastal trades between small islands, as you have them in Scotland as well. So it's so vast and so highly differentiated. So those are part of the challenge. But luckily, there are also really good solutions that are available. So that's something that we work on. And part of what motivated us at the Global Maritime Forum to set up the Getting to Zero Coalition is that in this sort of fragmented, highly diversified picture, how can we bring all the stakeholders together to have them work together on developing the solutions? And that collaboration is really a key part of how we're going to make this happen in a sector like shipping. So we've brought together all these different parts of the value chain, if you will, of the maritime value chain. That includes ports and infrastructure, that includes shipping companies, that includes the cargo that is traded, so that's everything from consumer goods to iron ore to everything in between, and as well as finance, civil society, lots of other parts of that ecosystem. And what we see in that work is that there's a tremendous amount of activity. At latest count, we've seen actually very close to 400 zero-emission demonstration projects happening all over the world. A growing pipeline of hydrogen projects, and I'll get back to why that's important for shipping specifically. Increasing number of companies like Maersk and O&E and IKEA and Amazon and Citibank and Societe Generale and companies that finance shipping, etc., making very ambitious targets or setting very ambitious targets specifically for shipping decarbonization. And together, for us, this paints a pretty clear picture that it's definitely possible to decarbonize the sector, even though it's considered one of the hard-to-abate sectors. In terms of the milestones to get there, I think we see two main areas that need to be in place. First of all, that governments, such as those that are represented here today, translate their climate commitments into really concrete frameworks and policy measures for the sector. And shipping is in this particular club of very, very few sectors that actually has its own global regulator, which is both a huge advantage and to some degree a bit of an Achilles heel. And in our case, that's the International Maritime Organization, which is based in London. And over the next few months, the member states of the International Maritime Organization will be deciding a new strategy for how to decarbonize the sector, including the level of ambition and how we get there and whatnot. And so for us, that means we have this really clear window of opportunity to put the sector on a Paris-aligned pathway. And so for us, that's this real opportunity to unlock all the benefits that come with decarbonizing the maritime sector in terms of justice and equity, development opportunities, creating resilient ports and supply chains, improving local health conditions around port areas and the like, new markets for innovative technologies and the like. So that's a really a lot of opportunities alongside just, bringing down climate emissions, which are also pretty important. So that's one of the elements, and it's really it's really unusual to see an industry that calls to be regulated in a way, and especially the shipping industry is not one that's typically been highly regulated, and so from that point of view, here we are really calling out for those measures to come into place. To enable investments into the sector, to promote clarity on technologies and the like. I think the other main element that we see as another sort of milestone, if you will, and that relates more directly to ports and urban areas, is sort of support for green shipping corridors to test and mature technologies and regulations and the like, and I can come back at a later stage to why green shipping corridors matter, but functionally they're a way to simplify a really complex issue. So rather than having to boil the whole ocean at a time, we simplify and focus on specific opportunity in specific geographies. And I think one of the reasons that that's so important is that we look at shipping's energy transition as an S-curve, and as in many other sectors, including the rollout of renewable energy, for example, a lot of the sort of the early stage, everything moves incredibly slowly, glacially slow, right? And then at some point, when the technologies have matured and the market has developed properly, suddenly it just goes like whoosh, and everything, there's a huge uptake. And that's how we look at shipping decarbonization. And so what we're working on more concretely is how can we, over this decade, so by 2030, how can we get to that tipping point, that when it goes whoosh, right? So, and according to the best guesses, or I should say the research and the sort of the analysis that we've done, about 5% uptake of zero-emission fuels in shipping should be enough to reach that tipping point. And that's not a lot. And green shipping corridors are an essential vehicle to get us onto that steep course and onto that whoosh. So that's one of the areas that we hope to focus more on, and I hope we can talk a little bit more on during this.
We can certainly come back and talk about that more later on. Let's now move over here to Susana Hufnagel. Vattenfall, Wärme Berlin AG, my apologies, not just active in Berlin, but you're also active in Hamburg, which is a major port city. That's Germany's largest port. What kind of technologies is Vattenfall looking to use to decarbonize thermal energy for the industry in Berlin and Hamburg and for that big port?
Okay. First of all, thanks for having me and for being in this beautiful round. Maybe I start with Vattenfall Wärme Berlin AG, which is actually the district heating operator of Berlin. And Berlin has Western Europe's largest district heating system, quite ancient, you might say. And to put it blunt, we are probably Berlin's single most big CO2 emittent nowadays. And that's the task we have ahead, and that is why we have, for years now, been chewing on this question, what is the best technology to decarbonize this system, which is supplying around 1/3 of Berlin with heat. The other 2/3 are mostly still oil and gas in single houses, and, well, there is a few heat pumps, but we are still waiting for that whoosh moment in that sense. From our perspective, there is 3 technology groups. And the first group is everything that adds to the thesis that the way to decarbonization is primarily the way of electrification. I think you said it implicitly already, especially since we don't have the problem that houses, which we have to heat up, move. That seems a bit easier. However, getting such a big system of more than 5 gigawatt capacity installed, and which is supposed to even grow, and also of more than 12 terawatt hours per year thermal consumption, we are now at about 70% gas. We are finally taking off the last 2 coal plants in Berlin until 2030, so that is the biggest reduction we have done so far. However, getting rid of those 70% gas is still a big way to go. So the first group which we look into is solutions that are power to heat, heat pumps, anything that is on the way through electrification. The second group we look up is actually anything that helps us for peak shaving, which means that we either have peak demands which can be shifted to other hours or even seasons, probably, which is the harder task to find, or anything else that helps us to be more efficient, to see how can we get supply down, how do we find leaks in the system, anything like that. So more or less to optimize and to help the peak shaving. And the rest, for the time being, is maybe a bit easy put green hydrogen, which is also a bit of a placeholder. By now, it's also maybe, there will be cities like Berlin which don't have the geothermal conditions like in southern Germany. There will be geothermal projects also here, no question about that, but it's not a game changer up here in the north. We don't have a lot of industry. We'll have some data centers to get heat, but not to have those 5 to 6 gigawatt capacity. And so it's a bit of a placeholder, and also we need things that can be stored and in seasons, and really if we have a longer period without electricity available, that would be kind of the last resort. But that's basically the 3 groups we look at, and which we are now implementing in the system. There's tons of projects going on to decarbonize the 12 major plant sites here in Berlin. And there is also a shift of the system. I mean, usually when people talk about decentral energy systems, we refer to as single housing units are very decentral. When we talk about decentral, it means that instead of maybe 10 to 15 major sites, we'll have maybe 200 decentralized heat pumps, even heat pumps in the size of 10 megawatt, 50 megawatt, 70 megawatt across the whole city. So that is my current position on or when I talk about decentral. In Hamburg, just to be correct, we don't own the district heating head in Hamburg. However, it's also an area where Vattenfall has a lot of activity, and also for other areas of business we are active in. The primary strategy is the strategy of electrification, and the Port of Hamburg was actually the first place where we had a large electricity storage in place for usage in fleets, electromobile fleets, which are in operations in the ports, and that was actually the very first operational steps and experiences we collected there.
Thank you very much. I'd like to look now, Fatsia Puusterla, move to another part of the world, namely Central and South America. The IDB is currently funding around 622 projects, 32 of which are active in the urban development and housing sector, and 43 specifically in energy. What are the key challenges, that your projects tackle to decarbonize cities in Central and South America?
First of all, thank you. It's great for me to be here and complement the already very interesting interventions we've heard from the perspective of the Inter-American Development Bank, which is a regional development bank focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean. So we have a very peculiar regional perspective, and just to set the scene, it's important to remember that most of Latin American ports are located where our biggest cities are. And this trend is growing. So this is where we see the maritime issue and the urban issue coming together in our day-to-day work. Second part, which is also very important, is that 90% of international trade in Latin America and Caribbean moves through ports. So also this is a huge number that we have to take into account. The last part, last 2 points I wanted to make is about vulnerabilities of ports and cities. Clearly, climate change has shown us that cities that are in coastal areas are very vulnerable, and this is tangible in terms of losses and damages that countries need to face, particularly in the Caribbean, but not only. Just have a couple of numbers. In the recent hurricanes, for example, in 2019, in the Hurricane Dorian, there was a generated losses of $13 million in the Bahamas only. And in Honduras, the Hurricane Dorian and Eta causes losses of over $4 million US dollars. So this is a day-to-day challenge that is also a growing trend. And finally, the other challenge we're facing is that with growing cities and growing challenges, the decarbonization clearly is an objective, but in the meantime, we're seeing increasing pollution, ship traffic, cargo handling activities that may disrupt other activities in a city. So this is the context. I would like to highlight 3 areas where we're currently focusing. Some of them have been mentioned already to tackle both the maritime challenges and opportunities and urban development as well. The first one is that we're truly supporting countries in enabling their frameworks for a green and resilient transition. Okay? This is somehow inserted in most Latin American countries and Caribbean countries' agenda. Still, it's incipient. Okay? So we're trying to make sure that we support the LAC policy agenda in having this item in, as priority in the dialogue and conversation of our policymakers. And we're not doing this alone. And here I would like to stress what my colleagues have already mentioned, that partnerships are fundamental here. And for example, with the Global Maritime Forum, we're truly trying to bring together different actors to move the needle. Okay, so this is very important, both in terms of transfers of knowledge, of best practices, developing policy frameworks, leveraging technology, very important for Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course, including resiliency in infrastructure building, which is fundamental. The second point that was already mentioned was about electrification of the transport sector, and I wanted to share some numbers that are quite surprising. We conducted recently a report that was published last year where we asked ourselves how electrifiable was the region. And surprisingly, out of 132 routes, we concluded that almost 40% of them could be electrifiable, which is really a lot. Now, this is the numbers we could be working on. We have identified 4 of them that could be immediately, intervened. And these 4 routes are located in 4 countries. One is Brazil, then we have Costa Rica, we have Chile, and we have Mexico. So indeed, huge countries. Looking at the future, and if we fast forward to 2040, in terms of investment, all of these activities could represent a total market of $6.8 billion US dollars. What does this mean? It means a lot of opportunities, including the idea of creating jobs. But again comes the challenge. We need to create the skilled workforce. And here, again, thinking of partnerships, we're working quite closely with Germany in terms of promoting green skills in the region. Okay? And the last point is about now answering truly your question about urban planning in port cities. And again, here we are working in many cities. We know that there is this growing trend, particularly now. We're working in Buenos Aires, Lima, and Kingston with very big projects. And again, the message here would be IDB works at a multi-level and multi-dimensional coordination with different kind of stakeholders. And this is very important because these are complex situations where we need to tackle various problems at the same time. So again, reinforcing the message that these are complex problems and we are, slowly working in them.
Thank you very much. I do want to come back to some of these complex problems, but first, Kirsty Burger, I'd like to come back to you. I don't know if you know Berlin. This past weekend, there was, it's called a Volksentscheid, which is like where the people get to go and say something they want to do, and it's an attempt to say we're going to try to move up our goal to become a zero-emission city, and it didn't work out because not enough people showed up, which is a real shame. But sometimes cities do take matters into their own hands, and they develop their own climate action plans so that they can decarbonize in these urban areas. How does the coordination of multi-level governance unlock the enormous potential that there is to reduce emissions in ports, in urban areas, of course?
Okay, so I was fortunate to see, I think, some of the people involved in pushing for Berlin to go net zero by 2030, which was admirable. They were cycling along, and I waved at them, and it was lovely.
That's fantastic.
It's my first time in Berlin, so it's a fantastic city. So it was good to be here and good to see that. So in the Scottish Government, we've got a lot of experience on working at at several levels with government. So at one level, it's hugely important that government works with business and a range of groups, but also different parts of government need to work with each other. So in the Scottish Government, we have a number of powers ourselves. So we, for example, have planning powers, but we need to work very closely with the UK government to set some of the rules around what type of energy we have, and they have the really, really big powers of taxation. And then we need to work with local government, because very often it's actually local government who has to implement and coordinate some of the policies that we need to put in place in urban areas to achieve that. So if you take, let's take heat, for example, decarbonising our buildings, for example. So we're working very hard with the UK government to encourage them and work with them to ensure that we support the right types of technologies. So we're really keen that we push hard on hydrogen, not just because we have the natural resource in Scotland. We really, really see an opportunity for hydrogen, including to some extent in heat. And with local government, so just to give you a sense of the scale of what we are trying to do in Scotland, we have 2.6 million homes in Scotland. We are looking to decarbonise about 1 million of these by 2030, which is not very far away, and you can just imagine the challenge. So new build is relatively straightforward because you can plan what you can do. You can put in a nice little district heating system or a heat network. Our older properties are much more challenging, and so in Scotland we've got a real mix of buildings, of types of buildings. So one of the things we are doing with local authorities is to get them to set out local heat and energy efficiency strategies, sort of plans, so that they map out in their local authorities what are the kind of areas that are most suitable for heat networks, and what are the kind of areas which are much more suitable for individual heat installations. And we will at some point have to bring in regulations in Scotland to require people to make changes to their homes. So that will be energy efficiency measures, but also switching to zero carbon, so we call them non-direct emissions heating systems in Scotland. So once the local authorities have these maps about where you have heat networks and where you have you can have individual installations or very, very decentralized systems, as you call them, then we have a clear picture of what needs to happen where in Scotland. And we've got a very good framework of how we work with local authorities. So in urban areas, it's particularly around decarbonising buildings, as I said, also how we decarbonise the transport system. So how do we give support, ensuring that we give sufficient support for local authorities to develop public transport and develop active travel. So we need to work like this, particularly with local authorities, but also the UK government. I mean, it's not without challenge because money is tight everywhere right now, and so there's always discussions between the central government and the local government around funding. But that notwithstanding, I think in the net zero area we've got very, very good relationship with local government. I think the final area I'll touch on is not so much about decarbonisation, but it's the point you raised around. Resilience, building resilience, and that's a huge issue in developing countries where people are least able to cope with that. But that again, building resilience in cities. So, for example, cities like Glasgow, where I live, right on the Clyde, which is quite a big river. It's a tidal river. Building resilience and adaptation has often taken the back. Is further down the agenda than mitigation, but it is just shooting up the agenda with increased weather events. So we're also working really, really closely with local authorities, and again, they're the ones who have expertise on a lot of the infrastructure and where some of the and best able to identify the particular risks in these local areas. So we're working very, very closely with local authorities to build resilience, to support them in doing that, and to making sure they sort of collaborate with other similar local authorities and share experience so that we can build resilience to climate change as well as reducing the emissions through mitigation.
Thank you very much. Susana, I think you wanted to respond, which I think, yes.
Yeah, or maybe to add on what you described, how you see the role of government or more decentral or municipality. In Germany, we have a law in the making, I heard, which is it's called municipal heat planning, which is kind of the same targeting those plans. Where do you have a heat system? Where do you have a single solution for the house and stuff? And I think maybe that was invented in Denmark, I guess. However, I think those things, they show very clearly, or why is the law in the making and why isn't it yet there? Because there is 3 different levels involved. There is the state level, or the federal level in Germany. And I think why are they important? Because they are the ones who are putting the urgency in this sense. They say, okay, we see there is federal states or municipalities who have been acting on their own. In southern Germany, that's Freiburg. In the northeast, it's Rostock. They are very far ahead with those strategies. However, they are a very few ones actually at that stage. And the federal government has seen that there is good practice, and they are the ones who are using their position now to also, have positive pressure on the other federal states and municipalities to go there. What does the federal government, however, lack, or the federal institutions? Heat, more than cooling, is a very local thing. What do you have as heat sources? What do you have of demand? Do you have industry? Do you have housing? It's a very local business, so there is no one-size-fits-all solutions. That's why you have the municipalities. And I think that is a very good example. And I think, Johanna, you said that usually regulation in Western or in market driven economies is not a very positively associated word. However, this is a kind of regulation. Really, I think all stakeholders are quite happy to see that it's happening, because there is mostly only upsides in there, because it's supposed to help us get there faster, to have a more clear plan, and also to make sure that the major infrastructures, being the transmission grid for electricity or gas grids, which are totally like somewhere else planned than in those municipalities, that they get in tune. And I think that is something I like about this concept, and happy to hear that you're there as well.
Thank you so much for jumping in. I want to come back to this now, because you talked a little bit about, we talked a bit about what government can do, what's possible from the governmental side, and I want to come to you, Johanna Christensen. I want to go back, we talked a bit about the Getting to Zero coalition, and it's committed to getting commercially viable deep sea zero emission vessels powered by zero emission fuels by 2030, which we already talked about. Wow, that's really coming up. What kind of support do you need from national and regional governments in order to reach this goal?
So, well, there are two different ways to come at it. The one is focused more on the technology, and the other is focused more on, I guess, location-based in a way. So our research shows very clearly that hydrogen-derived fuels like ammonia and methanol are likely going to play a decisive role in shipping's energy transition. And the reason why that is because they're quite promising in terms of, and to deliver that steep part of the S-curve. Like the scalability is a huge part of why they're the most suitable fuels for decarbonizing shipping. And as I mentioned, we need to replace 300 million tons of fossil fuels that are used today with these hydrogen-derived fuels. And these fuels are likely going to be quite a bit more expensive than the traditional fossil fuels, and that's in part because the fuels that shipping uses today is basically the sludge that's left over when everything else is refined away. So it's a byproduct de facto. It's garbage, and then it gets put in ships to burn. And so we need to replace that garbage with some like really high-end product. Functionally, that's quite expensive to produce, at least today. And so, but that at the same time, shipping could well be one of the biggest long-term markets for offtake markets for green hydrogen, such as might be produced in Scotland, in Latin America, where there's a huge potential for it as well. So from that point of view, national policy to support the production of those fuels is incredibly important because it can help bring down the cost faster. So obviously there's a green premium that's going to play a role. There are lots of private sector investments that are going to play a role in promoting the uptake. But that alone is probably not going to cut it. And so while we advocate for action at the international regulator, the IMO, national action also plays a big role, such as we see it with the likes of the IRA in the US, helping to bring down the production costs of clean hydrogen, and other sorts of instruments, the FuelEU Maritime. There are other sort of instruments that can help either at a national or sort of regional level to bring down the cost of that fuel. The other sort of the more location-based, if you will, that we work on quite a bit in the Getting to Zero coalition, and where's a lot of potential, especially for port cities, is around this concept of green shipping corridors. And this is where sort of first mover governments and cities can really go quite a long way. And so this concept of green shipping corridors is something that we advocate for quite a bit in the Global Maritime Forum. And we define that as a place where, so shipping routes, so typically point to point, where zero emission shipping can be applied and be tested out as part of that emergence phase. So before we get that steep uptake, and as a way to get us to that steep uptake. And in a way, it's a way of not having to do everything everywhere all at once, but just taking a chunk and saying, okay, let's focus here. There are good conditions in place. There are good willing stakeholders that are willing to invest. There are maybe good conditions for the production of the fuel. There might be other elements that support, and then you can go there. And here we've seen that ports facilitated by their local governments, can play a huge role as conveners, as bringing together the stakeholders that then put these green corridors in place. And there are already many projects underway. Some 20 to 25 projects are already underway. Some of those involving major port cities include Singapore to Rotterdam container trade, Antwerp to Montreal, LA to Shanghai, but also some bulk trades. For example, shipping iron ore from South Africa to Europe is a project that was announced last week. And so there's lots of different ways in which this can be applied. And I have to mention, just because you talked about the River Clyde before, there are a lot of governments that are supporting these efforts as well. So I think we're up to 26 governments signed the Clydebank Declaration that was launched at COP26, which is effectively governments that support the concept of green shipping corridors and seek to work together to establish these corridors and get these technologies, fuels, etc., regulations, frameworks, commercial setups, etc., tested so that we can get this broad uptake.
I mean, I want to give you a chance to respond if you want to, because I have a question that ties into this, but please go ahead and respond.
No, I think it's fantastic, and it's really interesting to think about. So I've actually got a couple of questions. Am I allowed
this to? Is the yes, please.
So I'll just one of Scotland's interests in this is that we've got a couple of our islands. I talked about our ports, which have so far been servicing purely the oil and gas sector, but they're now looking to transpose into hydrogen and green hydrogen in particular. So, for example, we've got a number of offshore wind farms which are planned to be built off Shetland. Shetland's right between Norway and Scotland, basically, and there's huge opportunity there to basically transform the oil and gas import terminal into a hydrogen import terminal with a port there. And likewise in Orkney, we've got the Flotta project, which again has got the opportunity to produce hydrogen from offshore wind farms which aren't that far away to support the local economy, but also potentially be a hydrogen refueling station for the shipping trade. So just these are things that we are looking at in Scotland. But my question is, to what extent does this, green shipping routes and the decarbonisation of the maritime sector in general, to what extent is that driven by governments and regulation, and to what extent does it also come from some of the large shipping companies themselves? You hear, for example, Maersk taking a decision on using more sustainable fuels. So the question is, to what extent can companies be in the driving force here versus just governments?
Thank you.
I'll respond just very briefly.
Yes.
So there are lots of companies that are being first movers, but I think for all of them, certainly with the conversations that we're having with them, they're doing that in anticipation of regulation, of coming regulation. So in other words, they're taking a sort of an anticipatory step out into the void, hoping that a bridge will emerge underneath them, effectively. and so this is why I also speak so with such fervor about what needs to happen at the International Maritime Organization, because this is the regulation that is, that applies at a global level and that can really help move the sector forward and make sure that those companies that have taken these anticipatory steps aren't forced to retreat. But I will say national, regional, EU has done an amazing job of putting in place a system or a framework that will certainly impact everything that gets traded in and out of the EU. So that's great. But this would be so much more effective if it was in place at a global level.
Thank you very much. I want to sort of say, yes, please, Fatia, I've got a question for you, but please.
Okay, no, just complementing on what was mentioned before about piloting and segmenting, basically. I think here the Inter-American Development Bank truly has a role, of course, for projects in Latin America and the Caribbean in offering support whenever there would be a chance, to pilot. As you was mentioning before, there is a great need to have the incentives to start off. So we're happy to support projects in the region in this sense.
It's fantastic. Thank you very much. The question that I have for you ties in with this as well. You know, looking globally, in the last 10 years, it went from around 52% of the world's population living in cities to 57% of the world's population living in cities. Obviously, there's a lot of discrepancy, you know, from country to country, from region to region. However, what is important is that about 70% of CO2 emissions are made by cities, by urban areas, which means when we've talked about this, we have to think about transportation, we have to think about housing, we have to think about, you know, how real economies can be decarbonized. I want to ask you first, Fazia, looking at Latin America, what kind of financing mechanisms do you need to support cities, or what kind of funding mechanisms are needed to support cities on their way to this post-fossil future? And what technologies and strategies are you deploying to create livable cities with decarbonized economies, also ports, and resilience to climate change?
Okay, well, it's a very complex question. I'll try to be brief. In terms of financing mechanism, more and more we're seeing the need of, implementing subnational financing mechanism, which, to be completely frank, are very complex to manage. So this also brings us to understanding how cities can get ready in being more sophisticated in negotiating, receiving resources, and then, of course, implementing them. Now, the scenario towards the future tells us, at least for Latin America and the Caribbean, that in less than 20 years or so, there will be over 100 million people living in only 6 cities. So hopefully, these huge cities will have this capacity. What I'm thinking more of here is middle-sized cities. We have a huge network of cities that is currently active in Latin America and the Caribbean. It includes over 150 million people. And the challenges that these middle-sized cities face are also related to these instruments. So hopefully in time we can strengthen their capacity. The second instrument, which is very important, is public-private partnerships, PPPs, that we need to be able to, see more, and again, having the capacity to work with these instruments and implement the resources. Okay, so answering the second part of your question, what we're trying to do to support, and as was mentioned before, not only the decarbonization challenge, but also the resiliency challenge. We're working on 3 levels with cities. And again, let's remember, many cities are also huge ports, okay? So we have the idea of working with neighborhoods. So most of our projects are to support neighborhoods, especially those that are by the river, by the port, to become more resilient, more inclusive. Because let's remember also that many of these neighborhoods are the most affected by poverty and by inequality. The second point we're working on is also promoting more livable cities in terms of transportation, which connects also with ports. And again, here are many examples about electromobility, bus rapid transports, or even using more bicycles. So many different examples. Again, we're focusing mostly on middle-sized cities. And last point, very important, going from the neighborhood aspect to what was mentioned before, the housing projects. So we are trying to build social housing that is resilient and that brings us towards the objective of decarbonization. There again, we have very different tools. We work these both from the public sector side, but also from our private sector arm, using interesting tools such as social bond emissions as well. I'll stop here, because it's very, very complex.
I think we have 2 panelists. Thank you very much. 2 panelists that would like to respond. Kirsty Burger, please.
So financing the transition is huge, huge topic, and touches on urban areas and ports. But that's why everybody wanted to jump in and say something. So I'll say a couple of things around what we're doing in Scotland. So one of the mechanisms we've got, going back to the point about working with local government, is a green, we call it a green growth accelerator. So basically it is supporting local governments when they have projects that have carbon emissions and help the social net zero transition. So ensure that we create sort of green related jobs, in particular where they have been fossil fuel related jobs before. We co-finance, so local authorities can bid into a pot of money we have in the Scottish Government, and we will match that, and that will be subject to the local authorities achieving certain emission reductions and creating jobs in the green economy as a result. So that's been quite successful. On financing, I mean, to simplify a little bit, there's sort of a financing issue about where the private sector can come in and invest and they will get a return in the future. So, you know, offshore wind farms, I mean, the market is mostly sorting that with some government support. So but that's where private investors come in and they get return themselves. There are other areas where it's a little bit different. So buildings, again, is about smoothing the costs to individual over time. And we talk about that in financing as well. So if you think, you know, currently, you know, a gas boiler, I'm going to use pounds, costs about £2,000 or something. But for investing in zero emission housing, that is going to, if we're honest, have much, much higher capital costs. We estimate that it's around, an average of about £14,000 or something per household. So that is huge. So you mention a number like that, and you know everybody sits up. But if you think of it in the context of the value of your house, now this works for people who have properties. It's harder for people who don't have properties yet. But you know, if your house is worth something like £200,000, and you can incorporate this into your mortgage and pay it off on a much, much longer time frame, then it becomes more manageable. So that the kind of tools we are looking at in the Scottish Government is about, you know, incentivising the private sector. So where is there a market failure, or where does government step in to help leverage in private sector finance? And in Scotland, we've just not too long ago created a Scottish investment bank that's focused on net zero to help with that, but also look at how we help individuals spread the costs of the investments they have to make personally over time. And in addition to that, providing significant finance for those who are just not going to be able to pay for that. So in Scotland, we have set aside £1.8 billion over this Parliament to support building decarbonisation, and quite a bit of that is going to be spent on households who are at risk of fuel poverty, who, you know, spend a very high proportion of their income and will continue to do so on heat, to make sure that this is a fair transition, and those who just cannot afford to pay for it get the support they need to make the net zero investment themselves.
Thank you very much, Kirsty Burger. Johanna Christensen.
Well, I think from the sort of the financing and investment perspective, so achieving net zero emissions in shipping, we often look at it as an investment opportunity as well. By our calculations, about $2 trillion worth of investment opportunity, most of which is on land. So about 85% or so would be landside investment into infrastructure and ports and the production of the zero emission fuels. And ports, and by implication the cities where they are, could capture a large amount of that value, right? And so because ports sit at that nexus between cities and shipping and energy, you know, they can support decarbonization, but then at the same time also get to reap the benefits of it, of that kind of inflow of investment, and in all three areas effectively. And so this sort of idea of being able to put in place in shipping it's called bunkering, so making the fuels available in the ports, also as a way to make it available for local industry and for other sectors. And it sort of becomes, and you start having this sort of notion of energy hubs, if you will. And I think Rotterdam is a good example that we've seen of them. I'm sure there are some of the Scottish cities that are looking at that as well as a potential for the future, to see like this is energy for shipping, but it's also for other industrial sectors that are going to be using the same hydrogen-derived energy sources, and it becomes a way of sort of creating jobs, green jobs, of getting inward investment, etc. And it benefits these sectors that depend highly on these technologies and fuels to become available at a global scale, right? So.
Thank you very much, Johanna Christensen. We have just a few minutes left. Susana Hufnagel, you're sitting next to me, and I see you nodding along, and I want to make sure I give you a chance to respond as well. We have a few minutes. If there's someone in the audience that wants to ask a question, have it in your head for just a minute. But I want to give you first, Susana Hufnagel, a chance to respond to the discussion that we've been having so far today.
Well, maybe less a response than a confirmation. I recently joined a group of women from mobility meeting women from energy, and we came to this conclusion that even though the industries seem quite different, it's about infrastructure and it's about major investments. And implicitly, we have the same question everywhere: what is the best financing models? I mean, of course, you can have like market mechanisms, like well, of course, also making alternatives more expensive, like CO2 emission rights and stuff. And I think that is one of the things which are simply where we have room for more. I think that is also a big part of international politics, even though, of course, EU is something, and then to broaden things, it's another. I know that, but I think that is also the point where it gets to private companies as big actors and to get us moving. I don't want to take my own company out of that. You could also target the consumers. And that is something which is also a mind shift in energy consumption behavior, or because usually energy consumers are targeted with the cost, and that's totally fine if you are the one who is the one who can influence the consumption, but it only works to a certain extent, and that's what you said, because you need the capital expenditures upfront, and that is nothing which usually, especially if you take cities like Berlin, we have a rather, or more than, I think, 70% of the households are rental houses. So the ones who pay the costs are actually not the ones who would have the opportunity even to invest. And that is kind of also a mechanism where, I don't know, it's about infrastructure and it's about these questions, and where I would also advocate that that it's a state role to get into there, knowing that, for example, also that is a driver for regulation, to make sure things happen smoothly and to get the credibility for the investments. But maybe that's kind of a reflection more to what you said already.
As one of those people who rents in Berlin, I am also really looking forward to that infrastructure. I think we did have a question from the audience. Linda, we have about 4 minutes, so I'll ask you to be brief as you ask your question, and then we'll see who can handle it here in about 30 seconds. I know that's never easy to do. A question from the audience.
Okay, my name is Bahaj, and I'm from the University of Southampton in the UK. So my question will be particularly about the UK. So I presume my colleague from Scotland may be the person to deal with it. There is a huge amount of pressure from certain sectors in the UK to decarbonize heating in homes by replacing boilers with hydrogen-ready boilers. Do you think that hydrogen is the best way forward to heat up homes when it is proved to be, well, evidence indicates about 5 times more energy intensive, it's more expensive for the consumer, and also it's bad for the environment? Or do you think we should go for heat pumps rather than going for hydrogen? And why is there a project in Scotland demonstrating that fact? Too many questions, sorry.
I'll try and answer most of them, and I think it was quite a UK and Scottish directed question. So, but others feel free to chip in. So as I said, our approach to decarbonising heat in Scotland is primarily through heat networks, which can be fueled by a range of sources, of low carbon sources, and following that, it's individual homes and electrification. We do see a potential role for hydrogen in the heating systems, for example, as part of a heat networks solution. The UK government is also going to make a decision this year on whether we can blend hydrogen into the gas network. And that would be blending up to 20%. So where we are is still looking at hydrogen as an option as part of the decarbonisation of homes. I think what we don't see in Scotland is a one-for-one substitution of hydrogen for gas in the network as a whole. I think increasingly, kind of for the reasons that you set out, the costs of doing that are pretty prohibitive. But as in a lot of areas of decarbonising, we still need to sort of look at a range of options and keep a range of options fairly open. So looking at things like hydrogen-ready boilers is one of the things we'd be looking at as well. That wasn't 30 seconds, was it? Sorry.
That was definitely not 30 seconds, but that's okay. We've come to the end of our panel, but I think it's unfair to you and to our audience as well who's stuck with us. I know that you'd like to respond, and I'll say, and we'll go down the line, our final statements, and we'll wrap up the first day of the BETD here in the Europasaal. Susana Hufnagel, 30 seconds.
I'll spend my 30 seconds rather on the audience question then, if I may.
Please.
Because I think one advertisement for heat grids, they are not the either-or questions. If you have a grid with a few, be it 10 or 100 heat generators. Some of them may be heat pumps, some of them may be direct power to heat, others may be for really low electricity availability, maybe hydrogen facilities. And that is the big plus, I think, of heat grids, at least for urban areas. It's different in the countryside. I only know the heat pump as the preferable solutions, but maybe that about heat grids, and I think it's an old system, but it's also a system where you can replace those things if technologies change or if availability of hydrogen or whatever comes next increases.
Thank you very much. Kirsty Burger.
I'll be super quick to
super
make
quick.
Up for my... So basically just to say thank you very much for inviting me onto the panel, because there's nothing like talking about what is happening in different countries and different sectors in person. You learn so much. I've been working in the sector for about 15 years now. You learn so much from events like this. So thank you, and thank you for the question in the audience as well.
Thank you so much, Johanna Christensen.
Well, likewise, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to join and just to make my final little case for it. You said it so well, Susana. Like the by putting a price on pollution, we can really solve so many challenges in shipping specifically. It's not just the sector itself, but it's investment in energy infrastructure, including in many middle-income, low-income countries that have an enormous renewable energy potential. We can cover loss and damage by putting a price on pollution. There's so many things that can be done. So yeah, for anybody who's listening and has any influence on that, please do so.
Thank you, Johanna Christensen. Fatsia Pusterla, close us out.
Let me also say thank you. It was great. I've learned a lot. We shared a lot about Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me just reinforce the three messages. One, we discussed about cities, and cities are complex, are growing, and they're systems. And this is why we talked about many different solutions that have to come together at the same time. And the last point is that, again, since the a majority of the population already in Latin America and the Caribbean lives in cities, and this trend is growing. Truly, cities are the solution possibly to go through to a decarbonized future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to my panelists. This was a fabulous way to end our first day here at the BETD. Once more, Kirsty Burger, the Director of Energy and Climate Change from Scotland. I hope your first time in Berlin has been fantastic so far. I hope we get to see you tomorrow. Johanna Christensen, the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Maritime Forum. Susana Hufnagel, the Head of Sales and Business Solutions at Vattenfall Wärme Berlin AG. I'm a customer. And Fatsia Pusterla, the representative for the IDB Group Office in Europe at the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you so much for this panel. Thank you, audience, for sticking with us.